I have a theory. Maybe the reason so many of us feel like we haven't found ourselves yet is because we're looking for a person who doesn't exist. Not in a depressing way. I don't mean you're empty or lost forever. I mean maybe the whole idea of finding yourself is a little misleading. It makes it sound like there is a finished version of you hidden somewhere, and your job is to go on this emotional treasure hunt until one day you discover her. The real personality, the real confidence, the real purpose, the real life. And I get why that idea is comforting. It makes it sound like there is one final answer. Like the confusion is temporary, and one day you'll wake up and everything will suddenly make sense. But the older I get, the less I believe that. I don't think you find yourself as much as you create yourself. Slowly, awkwardly, through choices, repetition, mistakes, experiments, and sometimes through realizing that some parts of your personality were never actually your personality. They were survival strategies. So while I make this little miniature coffee van today, I want to talk about whether we're supposed to find ourselves or whether we build ourselves piece by piece. Because the more I think about it, the more I feel like a life is not something you discover fully built. It's something you assemble. And sometimes, very annoyingly, the instructions are unclear. I used to believe there was a real me underneath everything. Underneath the anxiety, the people-pleasing, the need to be productive, the fear of being judged, the version of me that knew how to behave around different people. I thought if I healed enough, journaled enough, read enough, watched enough videos, eventually I would uncover this pure, untouched version of myself, the authentic me, the final me. But now I'm not so sure that person exists in the way I imagined. Because what does the real you even mean? You are not the exact same person at work as you are alone in your room. You are not the exact same person when you feel safe as when you feel judged. You change depending on the room, the people, the pressure, the history, the expectations. And I don't think that makes you fake. I think that makes you human. We talk about authenticity as if it means being one fixed version of yourself all the time. But maybe authenticity is less about finding one permanent identity and more about noticing which version of you feels the most honest. Which version feels like relief? Which version feels like you're not performing? Which version feels like you can breathe? Most of us are made of so many layers. Things we chose, things we copied, things we inherited, things we learned because they helped us survive. And that's where it gets complicated. Because some people seem like they were born knowing who they are. They have a strong sense of style, strong opinions, confidence in their taste, direction in their life. They look like they arrived in the world with a full identity already installed. But I don't think that's always true. I think some people had more space to build themselves earlier. If you grew up with stability, encouragement, examples, and enough emotional safety, you probably had more room to experiment. You could try things and change your mind without it feeling dangerous. You could be bad at something before becoming good at it. You could express an opinion and not feel like the whole room would turn against you. Identity grows faster when there is safety. But if you grew up in survival mode, identity becomes less about expression and more about adaptation. You don't ask, "Who am I?" You ask, "Who do I need to be so things stay calm?" So you become useful, or quiet, or funny, or independent, or easy to deal with, or impressive, or low maintenance, or whatever version of you gets the least criticism and the most approval. And people may even praise you for it. They call you mature, strong, reliable, independent. But sometimes those traits were not born from peace. Sometimes they came from pressure. Sometimes independence is not your natural personality. It's what happened when relying on people felt unsafe. Sometimes being calm is not peace. Maybe it's emotional distance. Sometimes productivity is not ambition, it's fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of being useless. Fear of not being enough unless you're constantly doing something. So when people say, just be yourself, I always wonder, which self? The self you created to be loved? The self you created to avoid criticism? The self you created because it protected you? Because for a lot of us, the first version of ourselves wasn't built from freedom. It was built from necessity. Then one day, life gets quieter. Maybe you move away. Maybe you get older. Maybe you start healing. Maybe the same coping mechanisms that once helped you survive suddenly start feeling too small. And that's when the crisis begins. You start wondering whether you actually like the things you like, whether you actually want the life you're living, whether your personality is yours or just a long-term reaction to your environment. It feels like you're falling apart, but maybe you're not. Maybe that confusion is the first honest question. Maybe it's the first time you have enough space to ask, who do I want to become when I'm not just trying to survive? And that sounds beautiful, but in real life it is very messy. Because creating yourself means trying new things, and trying new things almost always feels fake in the beginning. You dress differently and feel like you're wearing a costume. You try to speak more confidently and immediately feel embarrassed. You set a boundary and feel mean. You rest and feel lazy. You post something online and suddenly want to throw your phone into the ocean. Then your brain says, see, this isn't me. But of course it doesn't feel like you. You haven't practiced it yet. We confuse unfamiliar with inauthentic. We think if something is truly us, it should feel natural immediately. But some of the best parts of you might feel unnatural at first simply because they were never given enough room to exist. Confidence feels fake before it becomes real. Creativity feels fake before it becomes natural. Being seen feels fake when you spent years trying to disappear. Rest feels fake when your body is used to stress. So maybe the feeling of this isn't me is not always a warning sign. Sometimes it's just your nervous system meeting a version of you it hasn't learned to trust yet. That's why I don't think we should wait to feel ready. Because readiness is suspicious. It sounds responsible, but sometimes it's just fear wearing a nicer outfit. We tell ourselves we'll start when we feel confident. We'll make friends when we feel more interesting. We'll post the video when we know exactly what we're doing. We'll change our life once we understand ourselves better. But what if clarity comes from movement? What if confidence comes from evidence? What if you don't think your way into a new identity? What if you act your way into one? I'm saying this as someone who loves thinking. I can analyze one small feeling until it becomes a full documentary. I love meaning, reflection, journaling, the whole dramatic internal weather report. But at some point, thinking can become a very elegant form of avoidance. You can understand yourself forever and still not live differently. You can write about your dreams forever and still not take one real step toward them. You can study your personality like a research project and still avoid becoming someone new. At some point, identity needs action. Not huge action, not dramatic movie scene action, just small proof. You make the thing, you say the honest sentence, you finish a tiny project, You wear the outfit even though it feels too noticeable. You upload the video before it feels perfect. You try the hobby badly. You make a decision without needing 5 people to approve it first. These things seem small, but your brain is watching. Your brain is always collecting evidence about who you are. Every time you follow through on something, even something tiny, you give yourself a new piece of proof. Proof that you are someone who creates. Proof that you are someone who tries. Proof that you can survive discomfort. Proof that you can become visible and not disappear. And I don't mean this in a harsh, productivity-obsessed way. I'm not saying every day has to become a self-improvement project. We have suffered enough from the productivity girl-boss industrial complex, but I do think our habits quietly shape our self-image. The way you treat yourself when nobody is watching matters. The things you keep tolerating matter. The environments you keep entering matter. The small choices you make over and over eventually become familiar, and once something becomes familiar, it starts to feel like identity. That is both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because it means autopilot is not neutral. Hopeful because it means you can participate. And this is where I think the internet makes everything more confusing. Because now we're not only trying to become ourselves, we're also watching thousands of people perform who they are every day. We see people with beautiful routines, strong opinions, perfect apartments, polished aesthetics, healed nervous systems, expensive taste, and somehow matching ceramic mugs. And I'm not judging. I love a matching mug. I respect the mug. But when you consume too much of other people's lives, it becomes harder to hear your own. You start collecting versions of personhood instead of actually living one. You save posts about confidence instead of saying what you think. You watch people build meaningful lives and mistake that for building your own. You collect inspiration until your mind becomes crowded with voices that sound wiser, prettier, cooler, more certain than yours. And slowly your own thoughts get delayed. Before you know what you think, you check the comments. Before you understand what you feel, you search for a label. Before a small raw opinion has time to become yours, the internet arrives with a more polished version. That doesn't mean the internet is bad. I actually think it can help us find language for things we never knew how to explain. But there is a difference between being inspired and being replaced. Sometimes creating yourself requires enough quiet to notice what is actually yours. What do I think before I check what everyone else thinks? What do I like before it becomes a trend? What do I want when nobody is clapping? What do I envy, and what is that envy trying to show me? Because envy and admiration can be useful information. When you admire someone's confidence, maybe there is a part of you that wants permission to be seen. When you admire someone's creativity, maybe you're not jealous of their talent as much as you're grieving the part of you that never got enough space to play. When someone's freedom makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's because part of you is tired of performing. I don't think we need to copy the people we admire, but we can study what we're drawn to. Not to become a replica of someone else, but to understand what our attention is pointing towards. Maybe you admire softness because you're tired of always being strong. Maybe you admire discipline because you want to trust yourself more. Maybe you admire someone's honesty because you're exhausted from editing yourself for every room. That kind of noticing can help you create yourself more intentionally. Because creating yourself doesn't mean inventing a fake character. It means choosing what to practice. It means asking, what kind of person do I want to become more often? Not perfectly, not permanently, just more often. And that part can be difficult, because when you start changing consciously, some people may not recognize you. They may prefer the older version, the easier version, the version that said yes faster and needed less, the version that didn't question anything. Change can create distance from anything that depended on you staying the same. That doesn't mean the change is wrong. It just means becoming more honest can cost you the comfort of pretending. There is grief in realizing you don't fit where you used to fit. There is grief in outgrowing a version of yourself that worked really hard to keep you safe. But grief doesn't always mean you made the wrong choice. Sometimes grief is just what happens when an old identity leaves the room. So instead of asking, "Who am I?" maybe a better question is, "What am I practicing?" Because what you practice becomes familiar. What becomes familiar starts to feel natural, and what feels natural eventually becomes part of who you are. If you keep practicing avoidance, avoidance becomes comfortable. If you keep practicing honesty, honesty becomes easier to access. If you keep choosing yourself in small ways, eventually your body starts believing that you are someone worth choosing. This is not about perfection, it's about direction. And that's why I actually find this hopeful, because if identity is built, then you're not permanently trapped inside every version of yourself you've ever been. You can edit, you can rebuild, you can retire traits that were useful once, but are now running your whole life. You can say, "This part of me protected me before, but I don't want it making every decision anymore." You can become someone you don't have a long history of being. Of course, it will feel awkward at first. You'll feel like a beginner. You'll feel inconsistent. You might try something and stop. You might start over many times. But those unfinished attempts are not always failure. Sometimes they are sketches, proof that you are still in conversation with your own life. And honestly, that's what I like about making things. A miniature coffee van doesn't become beautiful all at once. At first, it's just pieces everywhere. Nothing makes sense. The instructions are confusing. For a while, it looks like nothing. Messy, unclear, unfinished. Then one piece connects to another. A wall stands. A tiny chair appears. A little shelf starts looking like it belongs somewhere. And slowly the room begins to exist. The room was never hiding inside the box fully built. It became real because of assembly, because of patience, because someone stayed with the pieces long enough. And maybe we are like that too. Not hidden treasures waiting to be discovered, not fixed personalities waiting to be uncovered. More like possibilities that become real through repeated choices. So instead of asking, "Who am I really?" maybe ask, "What am I building? What kind of evidence am I giving myself? What version of me gets stronger when I live the way I live today? Am I living on autopilot or am I participating?" And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, that doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're paying attention. That's where creation starts. Not with certainty, not with confidence, not with a perfect plan, just with noticing. Noticing what feels fake but might actually be new. Noticing what feels safe but might actually be small. Noticing what feels familiar but might not be honest. What you keep calling your personality when maybe it was only your protection. And then choosing slowly what deserves to stay. I don't want to find myself anymore. At least not in the way I used to. I don't want to wait for a perfect version of me to arrive and tell me what to do. I want to create a life that feels more honest over time. I want to practice courage before I feel brave. I want to have thoughts before I check if they're acceptable. I want to try things before I know if they are me. I want to let myself be a beginner without turning it into a character flaw. And maybe that's the whole point. Maybe you are not missing. Maybe you are not late. Maybe you are not supposed to have one final polished identity. You can become someone you didn't have the safety, time, or permission to become before. And one day, after enough small choices and awkward attempts and honest moments, you might look around and realize something changed. You didn't find yourself. You made yourself, piece by piece, and that is so much more powerful. In case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.